I always thought our suburban life was boringly normal. Manicured lawns, friendly neighbors who smiled just enough to keep up appearances, and the occasional ridiculous plastic flamingo competition. My wife and I had routines. Saturday mornings were for coffee on the porch, her reading, me pretending I liked her choice of jazz music. Weekends meant gardening, arguing over whether the mailbox was compliant, and waving at neighbors who seemed to have nothing better to do. Life was predictable, calm, and in its own tiny way perfect, or so I thought. Then the letter arrived, an official-looking envelope from the sealed with their absurdly intricate logo. I laughed at first, thinking it was one of those fake mailers the love to send, fines for improper mailbox orientation. Yes, my mailbox apparently pointed in the wrong compass direction. My wife rolled her eyes and said we should comply. I scoffed. I mean, who knew mailboxes had rules? It seemed like a minor annoyance, a bureaucratic hiccup, nothing more. We shrugged it off and went about our day. But that afternoon, things started to feel off. Strange cars parked at odd angles down the street, and men in uniforms paced the sidewalks. Uniforms that looked like police but weren't. My wife noticed it first. She squinted and whispered, "Honey, something's not right." I joked, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's a new landscaping patrol, checking if our hedges are hostile." She didn't laugh. By evening, the knock came. 3 men in those fake uniforms stood on our porch. My stomach sank. My wife opened the door with her usual calm, crossing her arms. The men demanded she step outside now. No explanation, no warning. My heart raced. I felt trapped, powerless, and more than a little panicked. This wasn't a joke. My wife, on the other hand, seemed almost amused. She raised an eyebrow, waiting. I tried reasoning. "This is our home. We're not breaking any laws. These are just flowers and hedges." One of them tried a smile, but it looked more like a grimace. They waved papers and badges I instantly recognized as fake. The sheer absurdity of the moment didn't make me feel better. The tension was real. Neighbors peered from windows, whispering and staring. No one intervened. Their silence made the men bolder, and my heart pounded. I realized the situation was escalating far beyond mailbox orientation. Their authority was fake, but their threat felt terrifying. My wife stayed calm, grounding me when I started to panic. She whispered, "Trust me." I wanted to, but fear tangled with disbelief. One of them spoke in a chilling, commanding tone. "You have 5 minutes." My pulse spiked. The casual absurdity of our lives, the coffee, the gardening, the quiet weekends, was suddenly gone. We were trapped in a suburban nightmare that felt like a movie plot gone off script. I glanced around for anything, neighbors, a phone, even a garden gnome I could use as a weapon, but it was too late. Time was running out. As I watched, the fake cops moved closer and my wife stood firm. The surreal comedy of it all, the uniformed men, their trembling authority, my inability to do anything, clashed with the fear coursing through me. Every second stretched, thick with suspense, absurdity, and tension. I realized then that our life, which had seemed so calm, was about to spiral into something I couldn't have imagined. And then my wife did something I didn't expect. She pulled out her phone, calm as if ordering takeout, and dialed a number. Her smirk told me she had a backup plan I didn't know about. My jaw dropped. The fake cops didn't notice yet, but the tides were about to turn. A silent shift hung in the air, an almost cinematic pause before chaos erupted. We didn't know how it would end. All I knew was that suburban life had just become a lot more dangerous, a lot more ridiculous, and completely unpredictable. I held my wife's hand, squeezed it, and braced myself. Whatever came next, we would face it together. And somewhere deep down, despite the fear, a tiny, twisted part of me was excited. The next morning started like any other, except it didn't. I woke to the sound of engines humming outside. My heart sank when I peeked out the window. 3 men in those fake uniforms were back, packing in our driveway like they owned the place. Their fake badges glinted in the sunlight, and their overly stiff posture screamed authority or maybe desperation. Either way, it was terrifying. My wife noticed them immediately. She raised an eyebrow, sipped her coffee, and muttered, "Looks like they didn't get the hint yesterday." I tried to laugh. It came out as a strangled noise somewhere between amusement and panic. These guys weren't here for small talk. They were here to intimidate. And me? I was the unwilling audience to a suburban horror comedy. They approached the porch again, trying to look official. One tripped over the garden hose, another dropped his clipboard, sending papers flying like confetti in a cruel parade. The third waved his arms wildly, attempting to assert dominance, but instead just looked like a man performing an awkward dance. I wanted to step outside and scream, "This is ridiculous!" but my feet felt glued to the floor. My wife stayed calm. She opened the door slowly, letting them get close, her arms crossed, eyes sharp. I marveled at her composure. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She just waited. And that was enough to make them uneasy. Authority works both ways. One of the fake cops leaned in, voice low. "We need her outside now." I stepped in, trying to reason. "She's not going anywhere. This is our home. We're not violating any laws." He gave me a look, half angry, half confused, as if I had just questioned the meaning of life. My wife, unmoved, just smirked. She whispered to me, "Watch and learn." I tried not to sweat. Then the absurdity escalated. They tried to drag my wife toward the car parked haphazardly on the street. She planted her feet firmly, and it was immediately clear they hadn't prepared for this. One pulled, another pushed, and suddenly they were all stumbling over each other, tripping on our welcome mat, falling into flower pots. The slapstick horror was almost cinematic. Neighbors peeked out windows, some gasping, some whispering, some filming with their phones. I could hear muffled laughter, and I wanted to hide, but the scene was too intense to look away. I panicked, tried dialing the police, but the fake cops scoffed. "We are the authority here," one barked, waving a fake badge like a wand of imaginary power. My brain screamed that this was insane. Authority, more like a tragic comedy, yet beneath the humor the fear throbbed. One wrong move and it could get ugly. My wife's calmness was a shield. She whispered, "Don't worry, they're outmatched." I wanted to ask who could possibly be outmatching these men, but I swallowed the question. Instead, I focused on their expressions. Sweat beaded their foreheads, eyes darted nervously, fingers fidgeted with fake guns, fake handcuffs, fake courage. Something was about to break. I could feel it. Then came the chilling moment. One of them leaned closer to me, eyes wide, voice trembling but attempting control. "You have 2 minutes." My pulse quickened. The absurdity of their uniforms, their threats, and my own inability to do anything collided in a strange, terrifying way. I felt trapped in a suburban nightmare where the stakes were high, but the actors were laughably unqualified. My wife, unshaken, reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and whispered, "It's time." She pressed a few buttons, and I could see the shift in the men immediately. Their confident postures faltered. Their whispers grew frantic. Eyes widened. Suddenly, they realized this wasn't just a normal suburban dispute. There was backup, and I had no idea how much. The minutes stretched, each second thick with tension. I gripped my wife's hand tightly, feeling both fear and awe. Our normal world, so orderly and predictable, had turned into a suspenseful, absurd battlefield. Every passerby, every leaf on the lawn, every click of heels on concrete seemed amplified. Then from the shadows near the edge of the driveway, I saw it. A figure approaching, calm, deliberate, almost cinematic. The fake cops froze mid-step, uncertainty flickering across their faces. My wife smiled faintly, a smirk that promised chaos and control in equal measure. She whispered, "Backup is here." I swallowed hard. Suburban life had just turned into a spy thriller, and we were the unwitting stars. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Whatever came, this was no ordinary confrontation. The 3 fake cops stood frozen in our driveway like mannequins. Even the wind stopped moving. Something had shifted in the air. It was quiet but heavy. I looked toward the road and watched the silhouette move closer. Slow, steady, deliberate steps. Whoever my wife had called last night was now here, and the fake cops could sense this was no ordinary neighbor coming to chat. I glanced at my wife for answers. She didn't react. No panic, no fear, not even surprise. She seemed annoyingly calm, like she expected this, like she had seen it 100 times before. That bothered me. Who casually has a secret backup plan for fake cops? What kind of life had she lived before this quiet suburban one? The man stepped into the light. Tall, unshaven, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. Nothing flashy. No uniform, no loud entrance. But he carried himself with the confidence of someone who didn't need introductions. His eyes scanned the scene like a scanner locking onto a target. The fake cops scrambled instantly. I swear they actually tried standing taller, trying to look professional. One even adjusted his fake badge like it suddenly became real. Another straightened his shirt and tried to hide the fact that he had been shaking moments before. I almost laughed, but I was too tense to breathe. The man stopped a few feet from the porch. His voice was calm, deep, and unsettling. "Morning," he said, just that one word, and yet it somehow sounded like a warning. None of the fake cops replied. They looked at each other, silently pushing each other to talk first. Finally, the one who seemed to be their leader took a step forward and tried to sound authoritative. "This is business," he said. "Please step aside." It was such a bad line. Even the wind seemed to cringe. Business? That was the best he could come up with. I immediately regretted buying a house in this neighborhood. The man ignored him completely and turned to my wife. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "Took you long enough." "Took you long enough? Took you long enough?" Who talks like that to a guy who just walked into a standoff with 3 fake cops? My mind was spinning. Who was he? "Was out of state," he said. "Traffic was a mess." Traffic, right, traffic. Like that was the real problem here. I finally found my voice. "Excuse me," I said, raising a finger awkwardly. "Who exactly are you?" He didn't look at me. He never broke eye contact with the fake cops. "Friend," he said. "Call me a problem solver." That was not reassuring. The fake cops tried to regain control. The leader stepped forward again. "Sir, I need you to leave this property or we'll have to—" He stopped mid-sentence because the man had already moved. Not rushed, not ran, just calmly walked past him like he wasn't there. The silence made it worse. No yelling, no threats, just a quiet shift in control. Even I could feel it. The fake cops stepped back. They didn't mean to, but they did. Instinct, like animals recognizing a predator. I watched it play out in disbelief. Yesterday, I was arguing over mailbox alignment. Now I was watching a real-life standoff in my own yard. And the worst part? I was starting to enjoy it. The leader of the fake cops snapped. Maybe realizing control was slipping, he decided to double down. He reached for his fake gun, hand trembling. "Stop right there," he barked. "Don't move." Even the birds stopped chirping. My heart jumped into my throat. I didn't know if that gun was even real, but I wasn't willing to find out. The man didn't react, didn't even blink. Instead, he turned his head just enough to make eye contact with the fake cop. And with a calm, steady voice, he said, "You sure you want to do that?" That was the moment everything changed. I could see it. The leader realized he made a mistake. His hand hovered near his weapon, but he hesitated, because deep down he knew this wasn't a man to threaten. One of the other fake cops whispered, "Let's just go." The leader ignored him, still trying to save face. "This property is under enforcement authority," he said again, louder and angrier. Then he made the biggest mistake of the day. He reached for my wife again. And that was it. Before anyone could breathe, the man moved. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. It was fast and efficient. The fake cop was pinned to the hood of his own car before his brain could catch up to what happened. Papers flew, metal groaned, and reality shifted in a heartbeat. I just stood there, silent, stunned, confused, impressed, terrified. The man leaned in close to the fake cop's ear and said something too quiet for me to hear. Whatever it was, it drained the color from the cop's face instantly. He nodded over and over again, like a child being scolded by a parent. The silent power in that moment was terrifying, but the worst part was still ahead. Because while one fake cop was down, 2 were still standing, and panic was about to take over. The moment felt like it stretched for hours. The fake cops were frozen, caught between disbelief and fear, while my wife and her backup stood calm as if nothing unusual was happening. I couldn't move. My heart pounded so hard I was sure they could hear it. The guy she called, her backup if that's what he really was, just stood there, scanning, calculating, and exuding the kind of authority that makes even the bravest liars collapse. One of the remaining fake cops stumbled backward, his legs weak, eyes darting between us and his fallen companion. "WE, we have authority," he squeaked, voice cracking in a way that made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. Authority. They were dressed like extras from a low-budget cop movie and looked like they had been caught stealing. The absurdity was surreal, and yet my palms were sweating and I couldn't breathe properly. My wife tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. Authority? She asked, her voice calm but sharp. You mean the kind you fake with badges you bought off the internet? The words were casual, almost conversational, but the way she said them carried a lethal undertone. I felt proud and terrified at the same time. She wasn't just calm, she was untouchable. The leader tried to regain control. He raised his hands like a child surrendering in gym class. We're just enforcing regulations, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The backup didn't even glance at him. He just moved slowly, almost lazily, and the tension in the air thickened. I could see the fake cop's mind racing, trying to figure out what to do, but all options seemed to evaporate under that silent, commanding presence. Then one of them lunged. I have no idea why, maybe bravado, maybe stupidity, but he stepped forward, hand outstretched, trying to grab my wife. It was the worst idea he could have had. The backup reacted instantly. One fluid motion and the man was off balance, sliding onto the driveway like a marionette with broken strings. He scrambled to stand, but the aura of control had shifted. He knew he was outmatched, and every instinct screamed escape. My wife didn't flinch. She just adjusted her stance, a small smirk on her face. Next time, maybe check your credentials before threatening someone's spouse, she said casually. I wanted to clap, cheer, and hide all at once. This was insane. Suburban life was supposed to be peaceful. Instead, it had turned into a full-blown action movie in our front yard. The neighbors were out now, peeking over fences and through windows. Some whispered, some gasped, some whispered to phones, filming secretly. I caught the reflection of one neighbor trying not to laugh as the fake cops began to panic visibly. Their confidence had evaporated completely. Every twitch, every stumble, every failed attempt to act in control just made it worse. The humiliation was palpable. The leader tried one last desperate bluff. We have warrants, he shouted. The word sounded hollow, desperate, like a weak echo bouncing off the houses. My wife raised an eyebrow. Warrants, really? Show me. Of course, he had nothing. His bluff had no teeth. The other fake cop started shaking, muttering excuses about paperwork and authority. I couldn't stop thinking about how utterly ridiculous this was, yet how terrifying it felt in the moment. The fake cops were outclassed, outmaneuvered, and outsmarted. My wife, calm and confident, had somehow orchestrated a scenario that none of us could have imagined. And her backup. He moved like a shadow, quiet, precise, unshakable. I realized then that even if they tried to escape, it wouldn't end well. Suddenly, the sound of a car approaching made everyone tense. I glanced down the street. Another figure, possibly law enforcement, or maybe more backup, was arriving. The fake cops glanced toward it, panic overtaking whatever tiny shred of courage they had left. They began whispering among themselves, clearly plotting a retreat. But escape wasn't going to be easy. My wife looked at me and whispered, "Watch," and I did. I watched as the two remaining fake cops realized the tables had completely turned. Their attempts at intimidation were useless. Their bluffing had failed. Their little act of power had crumbled. And standing in our driveway, calm, composed, lethal without showing a single muscle flex, was someone who made even the most ridiculous threats seem meaningless. I swallowed hard. The air felt thick with anticipation. The fake cops had one choice left: run, surrender, or do something foolish. And as the minutes ticked by, I knew something dramatic, chaotic, and probably hilarious was about to happen. The suburban nightmare had reached its boiling point, and I was trapped in the front row seat. The silence stretched, heavy and tense, until finally one of the fake cops whispered, "Let's get out of here." The leader didn't answer, frozen in indecision. And that's when I realized we weren't just winning. We controlled everything now. The balance of power had shifted, and the next move would determine just how far the chaos would go. The fake cops looked like deer caught in headlights, frozen and twitching. The leader, still gripping his clipboard like it was a shield, didn't know which way to turn. Every instinct screamed retreat, but pride and stupidity anchored him in place. My wife, on the other hand, sipped her coffee like she was watching a Saturday morning cartoon, amused by the chaos unfolding. I couldn't believe this was happening in my own driveway. The backup stepped forward, calm and deliberate. No rush, no shouting, just movement that radiated control. The fake cops flinched, their knees weak, their eyes darting like frightened children. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply stared. And somehow that silence carried more weight than any gun or badge could. "Step back," he said, low and steady. The leader's face paled. He stumbled, unsure if he had heard right. The backup repeated it firmer this time. One of the fake cops whispered, "Maybe we should just leave." His voice barely audible, but the truth was clear. They had no plan, no backup, no clue how to face someone who actually knew what they were doing. I couldn't help but notice the absurdity. These were supposed to be authority figures. They were supposed to intimidate. Instead, they were a circus of panic and poor decision-making. One tried to straighten his uniform, another nervously fumbled with his fake badge, and the third kept glancing at the fallen clipboard like it might magically restore their power. My wife finally set down her coffee and looked at me, smirk in place. "Watch how it's done," she said. And just like that, the backup made a subtle move, a small shift in stance, and the fake cops reacted like someone had flipped a switch. They stepped backward, then sideways, their eyes wide, mouths opening and closing like fish out of water. The leader tried to shout something about regulations again. It came out shaky, desperate, and utterly ineffective. The backup didn't even respond. He simply stepped closer, slower this time, letting the tension build. It was like watching a predator teach its prey humility in slow motion. One of the fake cops tried to reach for his walkie-talkie. Another had a hand hovering over a car door handle. Both gestures failed to hide the fear radiating from them. Their overconfidence had dissolved, replaced with pure, unfiltered panic. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, mixed with disbelief and the tiniest bit of awe. And then the leader made his final mistake. He lunged toward my wife, attempting to assert authority one last time. It was pathetic, almost comedic. The backup reacted instantly, effortless and precise, redirecting the man's momentum, pinning him gently but firmly against the hood of the car. The leader froze, eyes wide, realizing he had underestimated the wrong person. My wife leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, smiling faintly. "Next time, check credentials before threatening someone's spouse," she said, casual but deadly. The words landed like a hammer. The leader nodded slowly, utterly defeated. The other two fake cops were trembling, whispering excuses and mumbling about mistakes and paperwork. The situation had flipped completely. I wanted to say something, cheer, apologize for our mailbox orientation, anything, but I couldn't. I just stood there, overwhelmed by the sheer absurdity of suburban life gone completely off the rails. The backup straightened, looked at the two remaining fake cops, and gave them a single calm instruction. Their knees buckled internally. They couldn't argue. They couldn't resist. They knew they were beaten. The neighbors were out now, leaning over fences, recording with phones, whispering excitedly. I felt like we were in the middle of a live-action drama comedy special, one that would be talked about in our neighborhood for decades. My wife glanced at me, smirk intact, and said, "Don't blink, you'll miss the next part." I understood immediately. She meant the final collapse, the surrender of these fake authority figures. The fake cops tried one last desperate bluff, some words about warrants or authority that fell flat, hollow, meaningless. The backup didn't move, didn't flinch. His silence was louder than any shout, more intimidating than any badge. The balance of power had shifted completely. We had the upper hand. I swallowed hard. Suburban life had never felt so alive, chaotic, and absurd all at once. My wife, sipping her coffee, standing calm in the eye of this ridiculous storm, had orchestrated something I would never forget. The fake cops, panic escalated, fumbling and tripping over themselves, and I realized then that the tide had fully turned. They were finished. And just like that, the situation held us all in suspense. What would happen next? Would they finally admit defeat, run screaming down the street? The air was thick with anticipation. This was far from over, but for the first time in 2 days, I felt a strange sense of control. We weren't just surviving, we were winning. The air in our driveway felt electric. The fake cops were frozen, their panic almost tangible, and my wife and her backup were calm, collected like nothing could touch them. I stood off to the side, heart pounding, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Yesterday, we were arguing over mailbox orientation. Today, I was standing in a suburban war zone. The leader of the fake cops finally tried to speak, his voice shaking. "We have authority, authority," he shouted, flailing slightly, like yelling louder might restore some lost confidence. It didn't. The words sounded pathetic, almost comical, as if he were reading from a poorly written script. The backup didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply stared, his presence radiating control. The fake cop stepped back instinctively. Their bravado had evaporated, leaving only fear and confusion. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow, mingling with the muffled whispers of neighbors leaning over fences and peering through blinds. Some were recording everything, probably thinking they were witnessing a reality special instead of real life. My wife finally set her coffee down on the porch railing and crossed her arms. "Authority?" she asked, voice calm, laced with mockery. "Yours looks homemade." The leader's face went red. I wanted to laugh, but I was too tense. The absurdity of the scene collided with the terror in my chest. Then one of the fake cops tripped over a garden gnome. I swear to God, a garden gnome. He fell into a flower bed, scattering mulch everywhere. The leader tried to save face, glaring at him, but it only made things worse. The other cop muttered something about procedures and paperwork, his voice cracking. They were unraveling fast. The backup stepped closer, slow and deliberate, letting the tension build. He didn't touch them, didn't threaten, didn't shout. He just existed in the space, and it was enough. One by one, the fake cops' confidence shattered. They glanced at each other nervously, mumbling excuses. The leader finally realized his position was hopeless. He lunged forward, trying one last bluff. "We need compliance," he barked. I froze. My wife raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Before the man could touch her, the backup moved like a shadow. One swift, precise motion redirected the leader, pinning him gently but firmly against the hood of his own car. Papers flew, metal groaned, and the man froze, eyes wide, realizing he had miscalculated entirely. My wife leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, smiling faintly. "Maybe next time check your credentials before threatening someone's spouse," she said casually. The words hit like a hammer. The remaining two fake cops trembled visibly, whispering to each other, clearly trying to figure out how to escape with some shred of dignity intact. The neighborhood was watching now. More people had come out, phones recording everything, whispering, laughing quietly behind hands. I felt like we were in the front row of some suburban theater production that had spun completely out of control. I couldn't help but marvel at the chaos, the tension, and the sheer absurdity of it all. The leader struggled under the backup's steady grip. He tried to speak, but words failed him. The other two fake cops glanced around, unsure whether to flee or surrender. The balance of power had shifted entirely. The backup didn't raise a voice, didn't threaten. His calmness alone was enough to make the fake cops reconsider every life choice that led them to this driveway. I watched in awe as the standoff reached its peak. The tension was suffocating. Every move, every glance, every whisper carried weight. One wrong step and it could get messy. Yet the humor in it, the slapstick timing of their panic, the absurdity of their uniforms, the way they flailed against a woman calmly sipping coffee, kept my mind spinning in disbelief. Then came the sound of a siren in the distance. The fake cops stiffened. Their eyes widened. Maybe the real police were on their way. The leader whispered something frantic to his colleagues, and the two of them started edging toward the street, clearly calculating an escape. The backup didn't even look at them. The silent pressure was enough. My wife glanced at me, smirk intact. "Watch carefully. This is how it's done." I didn't blink. I couldn't. The fake cops' last shred of composure disintegrated. They were about to either run or completely surrender. And we were standing there, calm, victorious, in our suburban driveway, witnessing the full unraveling of their ridiculous authority. I felt a strange mix of relief, exhilaration, and disbelief. Suburban life would never be the same again. The fake cops had challenged us, underestimated us, and lost spectacularly. And as I gripped my wife's hand, watching the chaos unfold, I knew this was one story we and our neighborhood would never forget. The sirens were getting louder now. My heart raced, partly from relief and partly from disbelief. The fake cops were panicking, shoving each other, tripping over shoes and garden tools, trying to decide if running down the street was a better option than staying. They didn't have a plan. The only thing they had was their fatting bluff, and it had completely evaporated. My wife, calm as ever, leaned against the porch railing, coffee forgotten this time. The backup stood beside her, a quiet storm of authority. He didn't rush, didn't shout, didn't need to. The fake cops froze at every subtle movement he made, as if their very instinct told them they were utterly outmatched. And then the real cops arrived. Lights flashing, engines rumbling, and a distinct sense of order entering the chaos. One of the fake cops tried to straighten his shirt and raise his hand like a professional, but it came out as more of a twitch. The leader turned, eyes wide, realizing his little game had officially ended. The real officers stepped out, surveying the scene. Papers scattered on the driveway, garden gnomes toppled, flower pots crushed, and 3 terrified men trying to act like authority figures. One of the real cops glanced at them and raised an eyebrow. It didn't take words to communicate that these guys were amateurs. Everyone knew it instantly. My wife finally spoke. "We called backup," she said casually, as if she had done nothing more than make tea. The backup gave a slight nod to the officers, silently coordinating without a word. The fake cops flinched. They had gone from overconfidence to complete panic, and now the authorities had arrived. The balance of power shifted again, but this time definitively. The leader tried one last desperate attempt at control. We were enforcing rules," he stammered. The words were pitiful, empty, meaningless. One of the other fake cops muttered something about authority, but it came out like a whisper of defeat. The real cops didn't even flinch. Professionalism in uniform had just steamrolled amateur theatrics. One of the fake cops made a run for it. His foot caught a sprinkler, sending water spraying in every direction. He slipped, flailed, and ended up flat on his back. I could not stop laughing, though my stomach was still in knots. The other 2 tried to help him up, only to realize the real officers were now approaching and there was no escape. My wife smirked at me, shaking her head. "They thought they could intimidate us. They forgot one thing." I glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "What's that?" I asked, breathless. She just smiled and tilted her head toward her backup. The man gave a small nod and the fake cop's expressions confirmed it, total defeat. The chaos unfolded like a comedy in slow motion. The fake cops tried to explain, trip over their words, and apologize all at once. The real cops patiently listened, taking notes and shaking their heads. Neighbors peeked over fences, filming, whispering, and giggling. Our street had officially become a suburban spectacle. I watched my wife, still calm, still composed, as the backup coordinated with the officers. Their combined presence was effortless. Authority and skill overpowered bluff and delusion. The fake cops had no choice but to submit, mumbling apologies, papers scattered, badges useless, and dignity gone. Somehow, despite the fear and tension, humor seeped in. One of the fake cops, red-faced and trembling, tried to point at the flower bed. It wasn't our fault," he squeaked. The real officers didn't even raise an eyebrow. I laughed nervously, partly from relief and partly from the sheer absurdity of the moment. Suburban life had never been this chaotic, ridiculous, and hilarious all at once. The leader of the fake cops was escorted away, muttering about authority, rules, and legal repercussions. The others followed, defeated, flustered, and humiliated. The backup gave them one final look that said, without words, never underestimate your opponents. As the sirens faded and the street returned to its strange, quiet normal, my wife and I leaned on the porch railing, hands clasped. Our hearts were still racing, but the danger was over. We had survived one and witnessed the complete unraveling of people who thought intimidation could control a household. I finally exhaled, laughing nervously. The neighborhood would never forget this day. This little power trip had collapsed spectacularly. We had coffee, victory, and stories that would last forever. Suburban life would never feel normal again, but at least we knew one thing: we could survive anything. And somehow, through fear, chaos, and ridiculousness, a strange sense of satisfaction settled over me. The fake cops had tried. We had triumphed, and life, as absurd as it was, continued. After the fake cops were finally escorted away, the street felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispered in small groups, and some cautiously waved at us like survivors acknowledging another survivor. My wife and I stood on the porch, sipping coffee, catching our breath, and marveling at what had just happened. Suburban life would never feel normal again. I looked around the yard, flower pots crushed, mulch scattered, the gnome army decimated, and couldn't help but laugh. "Well," I said, shaking my head, "this is going to leave a mark on our mailbox at least." My wife smiled faintly. "Marks fade," she said, "but memories don't." She took my hand and squeezed it. I realized she was right. We had just survived something completely insane and somehow hilarious. The backup, calm and collected as ever, gave the fake cops' departing car one last glance. It was a look that said, without words, never underestimate the people standing in front of you. I felt a weird sense of pride watching him. He wasn't flashy, he didn't shout, and yet the message was clear. Chaos met competence and lost. Neighbors began cautiously approaching. One elderly man shuffled over, peering at us like we'd just returned from war. Sorry about the commotion," he said. I smiled awkwardly, realizing none of this was really his fault. It had been absurd from start to finish. The fake cops had brought the chaos themselves. I glanced at my wife. "You really had this plan, didn't you?" I asked, still half in shock. She shrugged. "Let's just say I like to be prepared," she said casually, as if planning a suburban standoff was a perfectly reasonable weekend activity. I laughed nervously. I didn't know whether to be proud, terrified, or both. Probably both. Letters still arrived, of course. Envelopes stamped with rules, fines, and threats of enforcement. I kept them just to remind myself of what we had survived. My wife would glance at them and smirk. "They'll think twice next time," she'd say. I nodded, imagining their panic at the thought of another run-in. It was oddly comforting. Suburban chaos was still possible, but now it was on our terms. Over the next few weeks, life returned to a semblance of normal. We mowed the lawn, debated over mailbox orientation, and waved at neighbors who now treated us with a mixture of awe and fear. The story spread quietly, whispered between fences like a suburban legend. The fake cops became cautionary tales of arrogance, incompetence, and the dangers of underestimating ordinary people with extraordinary backups. I often caught myself laughing alone on the porch, remembering the surreal standoff, the fallen gnome, the flying papers, and the complete collapse of their authority. It was terrifying at the time, but now it felt like the best story I could ever tell. Suburban life had given me danger, suspense, and comedy all in one. My wife and I would sometimes sit together in the evenings, sipping coffee, watching the neighborhood lights flicker. "Remember the driveway?" I'd ask. She'd smirk. "Every day," she'd reply. It became our own little private joke, a reminder of how quickly ordinary life could turn absurd and how prepared she always was. And in the quiet moments, I realized something important. Suburban life might feel predictable, boring even, but chaos can arrive in the most unlikely forms: fake cops, letters, and the illusion of authority. Surviving it requires courage, quick thinking, and sometimes a backup standing silently by your side. So now, whenever a letter from thee arrives, I pause. I glance at it, take a deep breath, and sometimes laugh before opening it. The memory of that standoff, the fear, the humor, the ridiculousness, reminds me that life doesn't always go as planned. Sometimes it's chaotic, terrifying, and absurd all at once. But through it all, we survived. We laughed. We learned. And suburban life, though forever changed, continues. I know one thing for certain: no fake cop, no ridiculous rule, and no minor threat will ever intimidate us again. We are ready, prepared, and maybe, just maybe, a little amused by the absurdity of it all. Because that day, our quiet suburban street became the stage for one unforgettable story. And for once, I wasn't just a bystander. I was a witness, a participant, and ultimately a survivor. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.